So let us continue our mission to finish the questions of PGI past 10 years. Intra-abdominal abscess, what is the most common site? All of you know very well that it is a pelvis. There are so many reasons why pelvis should become the commonest site. It is in dependent position, and also you have got the various pelvic viscera, fallopian tubes, vermiform appendix, any of them can undergo an abscess conversion. That's the reason it is the most common site out of all the sites for the abscess to develop. Now let us talk about some of the conditions, and are they pre-malignant is one of the common question. Familial adenomatous polyposis, 100% chance is there that it becomes malignant. And also you are having the non-polyposis syndrome called the Lynch syndrome, which can become malignant. Inflammatory bowel disease, especially ulcerative colitis, has got a high proclivity, and similarly the familial adenomatous polyposis is what need to be remembered. Now how about the pseudomembranous colitis, typically caused by the Clostridium difficile? It is not pre-malignant, it is only a toxin mediated injury, as all of you know very well. Now inflammatory bowel disease, do you see it in children? Very much. In fact, it is the most common chronic gastrointestinal illness in children and adolescents, the inflammatory bowel disease. And out of all the cases of inflammatory bowel disease, 1/3 of them occur in the pediatric population. Both ulcerative colitis and also Crohn's disease occur in the case of the pediatric population is what need to be remembered. Now if you are given an opportunity to do a small intestinal biopsy, for some conditions it is diagnostic, for some conditions it is very non-specific. So examiner is seriously interested about this. For which conditions is it absolutely diagnostic, and what are those diagnostic findings on the small intestinal biopsy? Typically for the Whipple's disease, agammaglobulinemia and abeta lipoproteinemia, if you do the biopsy, the findings are diffuse and definitely they are very specific. Whereas intestinal lymphoma, lymphangiectasia of the intestine, eosinophilic gastroenteritis, amyloidosis, Crohn's, mastocytosis, in all these scenarios there are more patchy findings on small intestinal biopsy, but still they are very specific. Now I will give you a short case presentation. Especially clinical subjects, whenever you read doctor, the best way you get out of it is feel yourself that you have a patient, and what are the non-specific reasons he has come to you. Out of that, how are you bringing out the diagnosis? In that proactive way, if you happen to read, the process of reading is interesting, purposeful, and also the memory will be long lasting. So we shall try to intercept our discussion with few cases. There is a 48-year-old male who has presented with the weight loss, iron deficiency, anemia, and abdominal pain. Now when these are the presenting features, quickly tell me, doctor, what are the differential diagnosis? That malabsorption syndrome is one of the important thing in your priority. You have to evaluate all possibilities. And any other causes? Malignancy, 48-year-old, little younger, but still we need to contemplate malignancy, excellent. So when the histology was done, the duodenal villi are totally blunted, and you can see the foamy pink macrophages which are studying the whole biopsy sample, and this is the Alshane blue, which is showing the presence of a lot of macrophages which are there in the villi. They are all being counterstained, and when the periodic acid shift staining had been done, the intensely PAS positive rod shaped granular inclusions and macrophages throughout the villus is a very characteristic feature. And also you can find that there are lacteals which are containing the fat droplets in the lamina propria. So these are all the classical features of the Whipple's disease in this 48-year-old individual, which is identified by doing the small intestinal biopsy is what need to be remembered. And after, how do you treat that? Tropharema whippleyi is highly sensitive to the management by giving trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. And after treatment you can see once more the macrophages are totally washed out. There are no macrophages at all, unlike the earlier sample. So that gives a wonderful relief for the patient. What is the closest differential diagnosis for the Whipple's, doctor? Intestinal tuberculosis is a closest differential diagnosis. Both are acid-fast bacilli. You are confused whether it is Staphylococcus Whippleyi or is it the tuberculosis. But giving sulfamethoxazole, trimethoprim, simple treatment will totally bring back the absorptive ability, and all those blunted villi become once more reformed and absorption restarts. So Whipple's disease in fact is one of the major enigma in lot of clinico-pathological conferences if you attend. It is one of the common diagnoses that come out at the last. Before reaching the diagnosis in a clinico-pathological conference in malabsorption case, in this subcontinent of India, most of the clinicians, what do they keep their first diagnosis? TB. Then they talk about inflammatory bowel disease. Finally they come, the pathologist will give the final diagnosis, it is neither of them, it is finally Whipple's. So how to recognize the Whipple's, doctor? The PAS positive macrophages, negative AFB stain, positive Whipple's stain, and the presence of the dilated lacteals, they are all the buzzwords for you to diagnose on intestinal biopsy the presence of the Whipple's disease. So it is the Tropharema whippleyi, male predominance, 4th to 5th decade, presentation with the low grade fever, diarrhea, weight loss, malabsorption, abdominal pain, lymphadenopathy, and also there are certain non-intestinal manifestations of the Whipple's, which we have to be very sure about. Whipple's also leads to the lesions of the cardiac system, and also it leads to the CNS symptoms also. Is it altogether more often a reason to confuse with TB? Definitely, only TB is capable of causing such a systemic diffuse involvement. That is another reason that TB can be confused with the Whipple's is what need to be remembered. And giving trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole brings one of the wonderful relief. Now what is the other option given? Can we specifically diagnose agamaglobulinemia by doing the small intestinal biopsy? Let us share a couple of cases of agamaglobulinemia. In fact, if I ask you a question, the most common primary immunodeficiency, which condition it is? Is it Chediak-Higashi? Is it agamaglobulinemia? Is it Job syndrome? So many congenital immunodeficiency disorders are there, right? Out of all, it is the agamaglobulinemia, otherwise called the Bruton's X-linked agamaglobulinemia, is the most common primary immunodeficiency disorder. In this, the germinal centers of the lymph nodes will be missing if you happen to do the biopsy. So can you tell me an accessible location where in the intestine you can get the germinal centers, you can look for them? Peyer's patches have a lymphoid tissue. So that is the reason we take a biopsy of them, and missing germinal centers gives you a clue in a case of malabsorption that it is a case of the agamaglobulinemia. That's the reason even that gives a very specific diagnosis. And the third important thing is the A-beta lipoproteinemia, otherwise called dys-beta lipoproteinemia. In these people there is a major problem. All the fat dependent vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin E and vitamin A, all of them typically are malabsorbed, and that is the reason they become deficient out of that. They will have steatorrhea, those who have A-beta lipoproteinemia. Chylomicron levels become typically very low, and on blood smear they will show the presence of the acanthocytes, and the underlying problem is they are missing the apolipoprotein B. And these individuals, if you do the small biopsy, you can come across the vacuoles which are studded in those enterocytes, lipid containing vacuoles, is a very characteristic feature. They will also show plasma, they will also show hepatic steatosis. They are all the important very specific features. So finally summarize, doctor, 3 conditions, diffuse but specific: Whipple's, agamaglobulinemia, A-beta lipoproteinemia. They all can be diagnosed by doing the small intestinal biopsy is the carry home message. Then you have certain non-specific conditions, non-specific findings, and they are diffuse. Which conditions on small intestinal biopsy? Celiac disease, tropical sprue, bacterial overgrowth disease, and similarly the folate deficiency, radiation enteritis, Zollinger-Ellison, protein energy calorie malnutrition, and drug-induced enteritis, it is all very non-specific. Now in this scenario we have to talk about two entities, tropical sprue, celiac sprue. Then all of you know very well, celiac sprue is a situation where the wheat, rye, barley, etc., etc. in the cereals, they are the proteins which are causing the damage. They have a hypersensitivity, and that is the reason their mucosa of the small intestine, duodenum and jejunum, typically become abnormal due to that immunological reaction caused by the gluten which is there in these foods, gluten-rich foods. And if you do the mucosal biopsy, what do you find? In the celiac sprue also, you come across the atrophy of the villi, but it is more non-specific, because even allergic enteropathies, cow milk associated allergy, and similarly giardiasis, autoimmune enteropathy, any of them can cause the findings which are very similar to that of the celiac disease. That's the reason it is non-specific, but there are diffuse changes which are being found on the small intestinal biopsy is what need to be remembered. Now, does celiac disease progress in various stages? Very much. Typically, normally you have a wonderful villus. By the time it is stage 1, it is studded with lymphocytes. Slowly it is undergoing atrophy. By the time it is stage 4, it becomes totally atrophied. That is a late stage of the celiac disease. So that is the story about the celiac and the gliadin and its hypersensitivity. Then what is tropical sprue? Celiac sprue is different from tropical sprue. In tropical sprue you have chronic diarrhea, weight loss, malabsorption, especially those who are going to the tropical and subtropical countries, they will develop it. Unlike the celiac sprue where gluten restriction will improve the malabsorption, that is not so in the case of the tropical sprue. That is a differentiation between these two important entities. Then how do you treat it? Give antibiotics, folate administration, they are all considered to be the wonderful way to manage the tropical sprue. So today you have quickly reviewed 5 important common topics for the entrance doctor. Celiac sprue, tropical sprue, Whipple's disease, agammaglobulinemia, abetral hyperproteinemia, you must be very sure and encyclopedic. Now what is commonness between sepsis and trauma? Both of them will increase our basal metabolic rate. Now there are certain physiological changes that occur in sepsis and trauma. Catabolism, both are hypercatabolic states. Similarly, both of them will cause glucagon, epinephrine to become high. Glucagon, epinephrine are all anti-insulin. That is the reason they will develop typically insulin resistant state. And trauma and sepsis will cause the capillary leakage and that lead to development of the fluid loss, and there are the hypermetabolic states. Everything is common between these two. Now let us talk about the Barrett's esophagus and the adenocarcinoma. Reflux esophagitis constantly causes the irritation leading to Barrett's, as all of you know very well. Now what are the morphological patterns of the Barrett's is what the examiner is asking us. Typically, is it patchy, is it linear, is it ring-like? As an endoscopist, shortly you are going to be DM gastroenterology. So how do you look at the Barrett's when you happen to do the endoscopy? Let us talk about it. Barrett's is that red velvety mucosa, typically which is located between the smooth pale pink esophageal squamous mucosa and the lesser light brown gastric mucosa. So it is a red velvety mucosa that you come across. It will present like patches, islands of patches in the gastroesophageal junction. Let us look at it. You have the islands of the squamous mucosa, that is the whitest tissue is squamous, is what you are able to see here. And at a point of time it will undergo a high grade dysplasia like this, which is the precursor for the development of adenocarcinoma. And it typically will be like a patchy presentation, is a very important feature of the Barrett's. And if at all you happen to take a biopsy, what do you expect? The stomach mucosa will show intestinal mucosa like appearance. Hence it is called intestinal metaplasia, which is typically a feature of the Barrett's esophagus. So in the place where stomach, which will not have this kind of appearance, it will have a intestinal like appearance, is the metaplastic change. There can be a long segment Barrett's esophagus. Instead of patchy, the whole segment can be typically be showing the metaplastic changes. So there are three types of epithelium which is recognized as the Barrett's epithelium. Number one, you have a intestinal metaplastic change, which is the most common type of change called the Barrett's in the gastric mucosa. You also can have a gastric fundus type of epithelium. You can have a junctional type of epithelium. Any of these three are the possible type of the histological changes which are indeed called as the Barrett's epithelium is what need to be remembered. Pancreatic endocrinal tumors. There are a lot. Out of that, which is the most common type? First of all, what are the different pancreatic endocrinal tumors? Let us talk about them. Insulinoma is the most common type, in fact. Even gastrinoma, Viaipoma, somatostatinoma, cholecystokynoma, ACTH excessive ACTH syndrome, then carcinoid syndrome, pancreatic polypeptidoma, and pancreatic tissue also can produce growth hormone secreting tumors also. But out of all, it is the insulinoma which is the most common, is what has to be recognized. Then 1 2 comments let us carry about this important entity called Viaipoma. Typically, the vasoactive intestinal polypeptide is produced by the non-beta cells of the pancreas. If this vasoactive intestinal polypeptide is excessive, then what will happen? It will lead to a watery diarrhea, and that leads to development of hypokalemia, and also it will be responsible for echlorohydria. So this combination called the watery diarrhea, hypokalemia, echlorohydria, called the Werner-Morrison syndrome, is also called the WADA syndrome, is typically seen in the case of the Viaipoma, one of the types of the non-beta cell endocrinal tumor of the pancreas, is what has to be basically recognized. What is the other name given for it? Because it is watery diarrhea leading to hypokalemia, it is also called pancreatic cholera, as all of you know very well. I will give a short case presentation, doctor. 42-year-old woman. There is history of loss of consciousness. Every time she is losing consciousness, when the blood glucose was checked, it is 25 milligrams per deciliter. But after giving glucose infusion, once more her consciousness is becoming better. And 6 years ago, she was also having history of recurrent seizures. And typically these seizures are happening immediately after waking up from the sleep. And in the recent time, she is finding that these seizure episodes are becoming very frequent, and every time she was having seizure and brought to hospital, she is found to have hypoglycemia. That is the reason, as a casualty house surgeon, the first thing, if you happen to see a case of seizure, of course phenytoin should be your priority and airway control should be your priority, but at the same time you should also have another line of thinking: check the blood glucose, because hypoglycemia is a highly reversible cause. Especially in intensive care setup, people will go into hypoglycemia and develop seizures. So that we have to be very sure about. And when 72 hours fasting test had been done, the serum glucose has fallen down as low as 20 milligrams per deciliter. And when the dynamic enhanced CT scan had been taken, you can see the presence of a round, well-defined enhanced lesion which is there in the pancreas. And what is your diagnosis, doctor? Insulinoma is the one that has to be basically contemplated. You can see the presence of how the insulinoma looks as a nodule in the whole of this pancreatic tissue upon operation on surgery, and also you can see intraoperative finding on laparotomy. You can find the presence of a nodule-like pancreas, nodule-like tissue in the pancreas, which is the one which is called the insulinoma, responsible for all these clinical features. Sometimes this insulinoma can undergo the metastasis also diffusely. It can go to the liver. So these are all the islet cells of that insulinoma, and you can see the reactive liver. So this is the insulinoma's metastasis to the liver is what you should recognize. So the most common endocrine tumor of the pancreas would be the insulinoma, is what I like to once more conclude. Now let us talk about the esophagoscopy, endoscopy. How do you carry on? Just like you hold a pen, you will be holding the endoscope. And typically between the finger and thumb in a pen holding manner, you will be holding the endoscope. Nowadays we are all in the world of video endoscopy, right? So you don't even look into that keyhole. You can, everything will be visible over here, and like a jet airways pilot, you will be sailing through the whole of the GIT of the patient, and if there is esophageal varices, you will be controlling it. If there is an ulcer, you will be taking a biopsy. Everything you will be finishing up by passing different guide wires through this esophagoscope is what need to be remembered. So the right side of the tongue, the posterior pharyngeal wall towards the pyriform fossa, and then between the arytenoids. Typically your esophagoscope will be typically be passing, and there is a small resistance the moment you are passing through the cricopharyngeal orifice. So these are all the things which are more often felt rather than being described, and you have to feel it. It's very simple. It's like how do you get an opportunity to do a endoscopy? It's like big brother forgot his bike and the younger brother has taken it out. So otherwise there is no permission. Young fellow is not permitted to ride the bike. So also when your gastroenterology assistant professor is little busy, went for a telephone, you must hold the scope and then put the scope and then check it. Nothing happens actually. Only thing is that most scope can become damaged, and anyway your assistant professor will be blamed for that. So, but you must be a very sincere student projecting that nothing happened to scope and you finished that experience of passing the endoscope. So that's the reason procedures are always like that, doctor. You must be treating your senior and then learning it, and it's a lifetime experience. Now a man is brought to casualty with road traffic accident. There is a paradoxical movement of the chest. What is this also called as? Flail chest. So typically in the inspiration what happens, doctor? Now we are talking about management of the flail chest is one of the favorite questions of the examiner. What do you want to do to manage it? Whenever we have inspiration, the upper ribs will be moving upward and forward, and that will increase the anterior-posterior dimension of our thoracic cage. Same time the lower ribs will be moving like the bucket handles, and that will increase the lateral dimension of our thorax. That is what is happening during inspiration. But when there are 3 to 4 ribs, they have undergone fracture at more than one location. Whenever we are taking the inspiration, instead of thorax, the intercostal space is bulging out, they will be bulging in. And during expiration, instead of bulging in, they will be bulging out. It's typically called the flail chest when multiple ribs have undergone fracture at multiple locations. Then how do you want to manage it? But before that, let us look at a radiograph of this scenario. This is a case of road traffic accident. Right side you can see multiple ribs have undergone the fracture, and on this side you can also see the subcutaneous emphysema also is there, leading to all that patchy opacity. And when the inspiration made the left lung to wonderfully bulge out, the right side you can see it is bulging in, which is typically a feature of the flail chest. So the flail segment will be moving paradoxically at the time of inspiration, and it will be moving inside his flail chest. Now the question is, how do you want to manage this case? Do you want to do mechanical ventilation, that is intubate the patient and connect him to the ventilator? Or do you want to just provide some sedation and relieve the pain? Or do you like to call the surgeon, operate it, thoracotomy is done, and then you have suture and repair and fix those broken ribs? What is your choice? Generally, if you bring a good pain control and a pulmonary toilet, that is as good as placing the patient on mechanical ventilation, and this is the common practice which is generally done. And suppose if the patient is going into a respiratory insufficiency, saturation of arterial oxygen is falling down, PaO2 is falling down, patient is going into respiratory distress, that is the situation. No more this sedation and a conservative management is insufficient. So that is the time where you have to go for the mechanical ventilation, and the intermittent positive pressure mode of ventilation is the one which is definitely required. Suppose if the amount of injury is significant enough to cause a chest wall deformity grossly, then you need to go for a thoracotomy and then fix those broken fragments of the ribs is what need to be remembered. So summarize, doctor, what do you want to do for the flail chest? Consult the cardiothoracic surgeon, and intermittent positive pressure ventilation is the one which need to be required, and these are all definitely because required because generally patients will be in respiratory distress with a flail chest. Now let's go to the next question. You are giving IV fluids. What is the best way that you can monitor whether your fluids are adequate or not? Place a Foley catheter, look for the urine output 24 hours. Your nurse must be very sure to good. Place correct I by O, input and output analysis. At least 500 ml of urine is minimum required. Your Foley bag must be full so that you are confident that this patient is not going to go into anuric state. Second is you place a central venous catheter and see that the central venous pressure is at least 8 to 10 of millimeters of water, centimeters of water is what you have to maintain the central venous pressure. Blood pressure definitely is a very good indication. So BP, central venous pressure, urine output, they are all the ones which are commonly measured and monitored. Central venous pressure, there are two ways of checking it, doctor. Millimeters of mercury, centimeters of water. So 8 to 10 is the centimeters of water, 2 to 6 is millimeters of mercury. So 2 to 6 millimeters mercury is the normal CVP which you have to basically check it. And how can you place central venous catheter? Either you can place it through the simple peripheral vessel, or you can also place through the external jugular or internal jugular, any of the ways you can be able to place it. So whenever the patient is on central venous pressure monitoring, the CVP should be maintained. If the CVP is less than 8 millimeters of mercury, then 500 ml bolus of normal saline should run, or ringer lactate also can run over 30 minutes. And when the CVP is 8 to 12 millimeters of mercury, look for the mean arterial pressure. If it is less than 65 millimeters of mercury, mean arterial pressure, that is the indication for norepinephrine drip to be started. When the mean arterial pressure is greater than 65, try to look for the central venous oxygen saturation and the mixed venous oxygen saturation, and if at all it is less than 70%, that is an indication for the dopamine infusion, and that is how you basically monitor the hemodynamic status of the patient. What are the normal values is a frequent issue in the exam. Normal CVP, normal MAP, mean arterial pressure, and these are all the values we should be sure about. Let us talk about the oxalate stones. Ethylene glycol poisoning is one of the causes for oxalate stone formation. And where do we use ethylene glycol, doctor? It is that colorless, odorless, sweet tasting. Something which is not having odor can still have taste. Okay, odorless, it's like vodka, still having taste without much of odor, unlike the spirits which have an odor and also a taste, bitter taste. So it is like the vodka, let us say. It is used as a solvent for paints, plastic, pharmaceuticals, radiator, antifreeze, and for all these various purposes. Now, what is the metabolism of ethylene glycol is a very important question. It is the alcohol dehydrogenase which will convert ethylene glycol into glycoldehyde, that typically become glycolate, glyoxylate, finally become oxalate, which becomes calcium oxalate. That is the reason ethylene glycol finally causes a lot of oxalate formation, and that lead to calcium oxalate crystals in these individuals is what need to be remembered. How do you recognize calcium oxalate crystals on a urine sample classically? So it is like a Yahoo mail, envelope shaped crystals are the classical appearance of the oxalate crystals is what need to be remembered. Now ethylene glycol toxicity, whenever it is there, which system become affected? It all depends upon at what stage after ingestion the patient had been brought. Up to 12 hours post ingestion, typically patient will go into coma, high anion gap, metabolic acidosis, arrhythmias, tetany, they are all the problems. 12 to 24 hours cardiorespiratory problems will be there. 24 to 72 hours, by the time enough number of oxalate crystals formation and renal involvement will be there. That is how the ethylene glycol will give time for the nephrologist to arrive after 3 days, but expects that you work like a clinician to take care in the first 12 hours only the intoxication. Now what is the best way that you can remove the ethylene glycol? Hemodialysis. So nephrologist should come first day itself to do the dialysis and purge out the ethylene glycol from the body. You can also give ethanol. Why ethanol? Ethylene glycol become glyoxylate by the action of alcohol dehydrogenase, which become blocked by giving your ethanol. So that is the reason ethanol blocking is the one which can be used. Then this is a favorite question of the examiner. Fomepizole is the one which is considered to be antidote for the ethylene glycol intoxication. So summarize, doctor, what do you have it for benzodiazepine toxicity? You have flumazenil, very good. Organophosphor poisoning, you have PAM. Then for the opioid toxicity, you have naltrexone, etc., etc. Then for the ethylene glycol, you have fomepizole is the drug which is antidote, is what need to be remembered. Sigmoid colon has a carcinoma with the obstruction. Then what is the way that you take care of this scenario? Then let us talk about a patient who has got a sigmoid colon cancer and then go how we manage the case. A 37-year-old woman presents with a pain in the lower abdomen and constipation for 3 months. 37 years, constipation. There is no other reason to believe other than organic cause, right? So let us think that probably she has an organic cause. Now she is intermittently febrile, not much a history of weight loss. In her, when transverse transabdominal pelvic scan had been done, there is a circumferential thickening of the bowel wall. Is a very important ultrasound finding. Then the sagittal scan has shown that there is a thickening of the sigmoid colon, and when typically the ultrasound probe is used to target the bowel, that time only she is having tenderness when the probe is used. Important clue. When the barium study had been done, you can see that the sigmoid colon has become narrowed, and this is called the apple core appearance, is typical feature in the case of the sigmoid colon malignancy. Then when the double contrast is being used, what is double contrast, doctor? Air and barium. Why do you use that? Air will enable the barium to spread, and mucosal detail of the mucosa become very clear. That is the reason we use the double contrast. When the double contrast had been used, you can see the irregularity of the narrowed segment of the sigmoid colon over here. Now typically you can also find the narrowed segment on the double contrast barium enema image also over here. So the final diagnosis, there is a neoplastic involvement of the sigmoid colon in this young sweet lady, 37 years old. How are we going to manage? Before that, how does the CT look like? CT scan abdomen. You can see here the irregular soft tissue mass which is involving the sigmoid colon, and sigmoid is also the place where diverticular disease also can be found incidentally, and this is once more a barium enema appearance which is showing that apple core appearance of the sigmoid colon malignancy. Now how do you want to manage it? We can do a drainage procedure where transverse colostomy, cecostomy, and we can do a Hartmann's procedure, subtotal colectomy with an end-to-end anastomosis between the ileum and rectum after removing the sigmoid colon. The remaining rectum and ileum can be combined together. They are the various procedures which are available. Now the question comes, what is this Hartmann's procedure? Typically there is a surgical resection which is being done of the rectosigmoid, and there is a closure of the rectal stump after resection, and colostomy also is being closed, and it is basically like an emergency procedure it is being done, and after that after the healing is achieved, once more the leftover parts after removing that involved segment, they are once more rejoined. This is like a temporary tiding over the crisis. Close the rectal stump and then open out the colostomy is commonly done, especially when there is an intestinal obstruction, is what need to be remembered. Choriocarcinoma, some of you are going to be finest obstetrician and gynecologists. Where do you expect that it will metastasize? It can go to brain, it can go to lung, and the liver, which are the common places of the metastasis, is what need to be remembered. Whenever it goes to lung, choriocarcinoma leads to pulsatile vascular metastasis, which can undergo bleeding. What are the three malignancies which can cause such highly vascular metastasis to the lung? Osteogenic sarcoma, choriocarcinoma, renal cell carcinoma. They are very notorious to cause such highly vascular mets. 20-year-old, let us take up a case presentation of this. 8 units of blood transfusion had been given because she was having a relentless gastrointestinal bleeding. Very young lady, 20 years old. Can you contemplate alcoholic liver disease or esophageal variceal disease in her? There is no such history of alcoholism in her in the background. And when the stomach and immediate laparotomy was done, and when exploration was done, there is a oozing polypoid lesion which is there in the antrum. When the pathological examination of the polypoid lesion was done, it is being found to be a choriocarcinoma, and this lady also on chest radiograph shows the presence of a mass lesion in the right lower zone, and this right lower lobe mass lesion, when it had been biopsied, it is also showing the presence of the choriocarcinoma, which can have a metastasis to the lung, is the carry home message here. Let us take up another lady, Asian woman, who presented with an upper abdominal pain and distension, and typically she is having weight loss for the past 1 month, and she is gravida 3 para 2, and when the celiac angiogram had been done, you can see multiple hypervascular masses with abnormal tumor blush and vessels with aneurysmal dilatation of the hepatic arteries, all because of some hepatic metastasis which is happening here. When the venous phase of the celiac angiogram had been taken, then you can see the aneurysmal hepatic and splenic vascular leaks. When the diagnostic laparoscopy was done and those hepatic mass lesions had been taken out and biopsied, classically they were showing choriocarcinoma, and incidentally her serum beta HCG values are around 2 lakh milli-international units per ml, once more substantiating the diagnosis. So choriocarcinoma can have metastasis to the liver, to the lung, to the brain, more commonly, and rarely to the GIT, is what we have to basically remember.